Hi, my name is Dr. Lauren Hallian, and this
is a necessarily brief and highly incomplete history of anxiety disorders.
The idea of anxiety as an illness has existed since at least the time of the philosophers of ancient Greece and Egypt, folks like Hippocrates, Cicero, and Seneca. That's 100 years BC, give or take a few hundred on either side. These early philosophers previewed some of the distinctions we still use to this day, like the distinction between trait anxiety, which is how anxious you are in general, and state anxiety, which is how anxious you are right now. They also distinguished between fear, which is the response we have to an immediate threat, like being chased by a dinosaur, from anxiety, which is the more chronic response we have to a vague future threat, like if the dinosaur was your professor warning you about a very difficult final exam. Then anxiety went under the radar for a bit in the medical literature. Fear and anxiety were mentioned in medical texts throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, but they were usually lumped in with melancholia, which is similar to what we think of today as depression. It wasn't until around the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the time of Freud and Kraepelin, that fear and anxiety started to be looked at separately again, with different diagnostic labels for different ways that anxiety seemed to present itself. Then, in 1952, the first version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, was published. The DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it's the first version published of the mental health classification system used in the United States today. The first version of the DSM included descriptions of different anxiety problems, along with information about the proposed causes of those problems, largely grounded in psychoanalytic theory. The second version of the DSM in 1968 swapped the word reaction for neuroses, but otherwise it didn't change a whole lot. Then, in 1980, things did change a lot. Etiology, which means the cause of mental disorder, was removed from the DSM entirely, and the DSM became a descriptive system. Unlike previous versions, the DSM focused exclusively on reported and observable symptoms without making assumptions about where those symptoms came from. The DSM-3 was also the first to include explicit diagnostic criteria. To be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder using the DSM meant you needed to be experiencing a certain number of symptoms associated with that disorder. That model continues today. The DSM-3 also included a diagnostic hierarchy, wherein an anxiety disorder could not be diagnosed if it only occurred in the context of a mood disorder or a psychotic disorder, which were considered more serious disorders. The DSM-3 revised version also made some important changes. A big focus there was on improving reliability, which in this context means whether people with the same symptoms would receive the same diagnosis from different clinicians or researchers. The hierarchy rule was also removed, except in the case of generalized anxiety disorder, which still could not be diagnosed if it occurred only in the context of a mood disorder, like major depression. In 1994, the DSM-4 was published. The DSM-4 included more diagnoses compared to the DSM-3 revised version, and was also the first to include a requirement that the problems cause clinically significant distress or impairment in order to be diagnosed. That means that just being anxious would not be enough to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. To get an anxiety disorder diagnosis, the symptoms would really have to bother the person or cause problems in the person's daily life. The DSM-5 looked fairly similar to the DSM-4, except again, there were more diagnoses, and this time there were separate chapters in the DSM for anxiety disorders compared to obsessive compulsive and related disorders, and trauma and stressor-related disorders. And finally, the diagnostic hierarchy was removed for generalized anxiety disorder, which can now be diagnosed even if those symptoms only occur while the person is also depressed. This is what those chapters look like today. This diagram doesn't include all the disorders that fall under these categories. These are just a sampling. Is this too many diagnoses? Is it too few? What anxiety-related problems might not be captured here? And that brings us to the question of where we go from here. What questions do we need to ask as researchers, as clinicians, as students, as people who experience anxiety, if we want to improve our classification of anxiety? Where has the system gone wrong? And where has it gone right? And what are the important questions that are still unanswered?